Have you ever been gripped by a fear so intense that it felt like your heart might actually stop beating? That paralyzing moment when anxiety floods your system and every fiber of your being screams that you're in danger, even when logically you know you're safe. Maybe it was standing at the edge of a cliff, or walking alone down a dark street, or facing a medical diagnosis that changed everything. In that moment, fear doesn't just visit you, it consumes you. I want to tell you something that might sound impossible right now, but stay with me. What if I told you that in the midst of your deepest fears, there's a promise so powerful, so unshakable, that it can transform terror into peace? What if the very thing that's been keeping you awake at night could become the doorway to experiencing safety like you've never known before? My name is Sarah, and for the past 15 years, I've been walking alongside people who are drowning in fear. I've seen panic attacks that left grown men curled up on bathroom floors. I've watched mothers who couldn't sleep because they were terrified something would happen to their children. I've counseled teenagers who were so afraid of failure that they stopped trying altogether. And through it all, I've discovered something that the world doesn't want you to know about overcoming fear. But here's what makes this different from every other self-help video you've watched. This isn't about positive thinking or breathing techniques or visualization exercises, though those things can help. This is about tapping into a promise that's been available to humanity for over 2,000 years. A promise that doesn't depend on your strength, your circumstances, or your ability to figure everything out. A promise that says, you can be safe, truly safe, even when everything around you feels like it's falling apart. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You've tried prayer before, you've asked God to take away your fear, and it didn't work. Or maybe you're not even sure you believe in God at all. Maybe you're watching this video because you're desperate and you'll try anything at this point. I get it. I've been there. And I want you to know that wherever you're coming from, whatever you believe or don't believe right now, this message is for you. Because fear doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care if you're religious or not. It doesn't care if you're successful or struggling, young or old, confident or insecure. Fear is the great equalizer, and it's been humanity's companion since the very beginning. But so has this promise. And today, I'm going to show you exactly how to access it. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through 3 revolutionary discoveries that will completely change how you understand fear and safety. First, I'll reveal why your current strategies for dealing with fear are actually making it worse, and what you need to do instead. Second, I'll show you the specific promise that Jesus made about fear and why it's more practical and powerful than you've ever imagined. And third, I'll give you a step-by-step process for experiencing this supernatural safety, even in situations that would normally terrify you. But before we dive in, let me share something personal with you. 3 years ago, I was diagnosed with a rare heart condition. The doctors weren't sure how long I had to live. I remember sitting in that sterile hospital room, feeling like the walls were closing in around me. The fear was so intense that I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything except dying. I had spent years helping other people overcome their fears, but suddenly I was face to face with my own mortality, and nothing I had learned seemed to matter. That night, alone in my hospital bed, I cried out to God in a way I never had before. Not the polite, proper prayers I was used to, but raw, desperate pleading. And something happened that I still can't fully explain. A peace settled over me that was completely contrary to my circumstances, not because my situation had changed, but because I had finally understood what it really means to be safe in His arms. The medical reports hadn't changed. The prognosis was still uncertain, but something fundamental had shifted inside me. I had discovered a safety that doesn't depend on having all the answers or controlling all the outcomes. A safety that exists in the middle of the storm, not just after it passes. And here's the thing that blew my mind. This wasn't some mystical, ethereal experience that only certain people can access. This was Jesus keeping a very specific promise he made to his followers. A promise that's been hiding in plain sight in Scripture, but that most of us have never really understood or experienced. You see, when Jesus talked about fear, he wasn't speaking theoretically. He was addressing real people facing real threats: political persecution, financial ruin, family rejection, physical danger, disease, death. These weren't people living comfortable suburban lives who were worried about minor inconveniences. These were people whose fears could literally kill them. And to these people, in the midst of their terror, Jesus made a promise that was so bold, so audacious, that it sounds almost too good to be true. He promised them safety, not the absence of danger, but something far more powerful. He promised them a refuge that no storm could touch, no enemy could breach, no circumstance could destroy. But here's where most people get confused. They think this promise is about God preventing bad things from happening to them. So when bad things do happen, they assume the promise doesn't work, or that God has forgotten about them, or that they don't have enough faith, and they give up on the very thing that could actually save them. The promise isn't about avoiding the storm, it's about having an unshakable place of safety inside the storm. It's not about fear never visiting you, it's about fear losing its power to control you. It's not about having all the answers, it's about being held by someone who does. Think about it this way. When a child is afraid of a thunderstorm, what makes them feel safe? Is it the storm going away? Sometimes. But more often, it's being held by someone they trust, someone bigger and stronger than they are, someone who isn't afraid of the thunder. In their parents' arms, the storm is still raging outside, but the child feels completely secure. That's a picture of what Jesus is offering you. Not a life without storms, but arms that are stronger than any storm you'll ever face. Not the elimination of things that could hurt you, but a refuge where those things lose their power to destroy your peace. Now, I want to be completely honest with you about something. This isn't a magic formula that makes all your problems disappear overnight. This isn't about claiming some kind of immunity from the difficulties of life. Christians get sick. They lose jobs. They face rejection and disappointment and heartbreak just like everyone else. But what they have access to, what you have access to, is a safety that transcends circumstances, a security that doesn't depend on everything going right in your life, a peace that's deeper than your problems and stronger than your fears. And the beautiful thing is, this isn't something you have to earn or achieve or become worthy of. It's not based on how spiritual you are, or how much faith you have, or how perfectly you follow all the rules. It's based on a promise that Jesus made, and Jesus keeps his promises. I've seen this work in the most impossible situations. I've watched parents find peace in the middle of their child's cancer diagnosis. I've seen people face bankruptcy without falling apart. I've witnessed individuals walk through divorce, job loss, and even the death of loved ones with a strength that defied explanation. Not because they were superhuman, but because they had learned to rest in arms that are stronger than their circumstances. They had discovered what it really means to be safe in him. But how does this actually work? How do you move from knowing about this promise to actually experiencing it? How do you access this supernatural safety when fear is breathing down your neck and your heart is racing and your mind is spinning with worst-case scenarios? That's exactly what we're going to explore next, because understanding the promise is just the beginning. The real transformation happens when you learn how to live inside that promise, how to make it your daily reality, instead of just a nice idea you heard about once. I'm going to show you the 3-step process that I've used with hundreds of clients, and that I use myself every time fear tries to take over my thoughts. It's simple enough that you can remember it in the middle of a panic attack, but powerful enough to revolutionize your entire relationship with fear. But first, I need to address something that might be holding you back. Maybe you're thinking, this sounds too good to be true, or I've tried trusting God before and it didn't work. Or, what if I don't have enough faith for this to work for me? I want you to know that those doubts don't disqualify you from this promise. In fact, they might be exactly what qualifies you for it. Because this isn't about your faith being strong enough. It's about His arms being strong enough. And they are. The people who experience this kind of supernatural safety aren't the ones who have it all figured out. They're not the spiritual superstars with unshakable confidence. They're ordinary people who have learned to lean into a promise that's bigger than their doubts, stronger than their fears, and more reliable than their feelings. They're people just like you who got tired of being controlled by anxiety and decided to discover what it really means to be held by someone who is never surprised, never overwhelmed, and never lets go. Are you ready to discover what that looks like? Because what I'm about to share with you will challenge everything you think you know about dealing with fear. Most people approach fear like they're fighting a war. They try to defeat it, overcome it, push through it, or ignore it completely. But here's what I've learned after working with thousands of people who were trapped in cycles of anxiety and terror. Fighting fear makes it stronger. When you resist fear, you're actually feeding it. You're telling your nervous system that there really is something to be afraid of, something so dangerous that you need to go into battle mode. And your body responds accordingly, flooding you with stress hormones, putting you on high alert, keeping you in a constant state of vigilance that's absolutely exhausting. Think about the last time you tried to stop being afraid of something. Maybe it was flying or public speaking or that medical test you needed to get. Did telling yourself, "Don't be afraid," actually make the fear go away? Of course not. If anything, it probably made you more anxious because now you were afraid of being afraid. This is the trap that most fear management strategies fall into. They're based on the assumption that fear is the enemy, something to be eliminated or controlled. But what if I told you that fear isn't your enemy at all? What if it's actually trying to protect you, even when it's misguided? What if the solution isn't to fight fear, but to find something bigger than fear to rest in? This is where most people get it completely backwards. They think courage means the absence of fear. But real courage isn't about not being afraid. Real courage is about being afraid and knowing you're still safe anyway. It's about feeling the fear and choosing to trust something greater than what you're feeling. And this is exactly what Jesus understood when He spoke to His disciples about fear. He didn't tell them they would never be afraid. He told them that when they were afraid, they could come to Him and find rest. He didn't promise them a life without danger. He promised them a refuge that danger couldn't touch. But here's the part that most people miss completely. This refuge isn't something you access once and then you're good for life. It's not like getting vaccinated against fear. It's more like breathing. You have to keep doing it, keep returning to it, keep choosing it moment by moment, especially when everything in your circumstances is screaming at you to panic. I learned this the hard way during my own health crisis. That moment of peace I experienced in the hospital wasn't a one-time fix. Over the following months, as I went through treatments and faced uncertainty about my future, I had to learn how to return to that place of safety over and over again. Some days I was successful, other days I found myself spiraling into anxiety and had to find my way back. But each time I returned to that promise, each time I chose to rest in His arms instead of wrestling with my fears, something changed inside me. Not just in that moment, but permanently. I was building what I now call fear resilience. Not the ability to never be afraid, but the ability to find safety even when I am afraid. And this is what I want to teach you how to do. Because once you understand how this actually works, once you experience what it feels like to be genuinely safe, even when your circumstances are scary, it changes everything. Your whole relationship with uncertainty transforms. Your capacity to handle difficult situations expands. You stop being controlled by what-if thoughts because you know that whatever happens, you have a place to go. But I need to warn you about something. The moment you start experiencing this kind of supernatural safety, your mind is going to try to talk you out of it. It's going to tell you that it's too simple, or that you're being naive, or that you need to worry more in order to be responsible. This is completely normal, and it's actually a sign that you're on the right track. Your mind has been trained to believe that safety comes from control, from having all the information, from being prepared for every possible scenario. So when you start experiencing safety that doesn't depend on any of those things, it's going to feel foreign, even dangerous. Your logical mind is going to resist it because it doesn't make sense according to the rules you've been living by. But here's what I want you to remember. The safety that comes from control is an illusion. You can't actually control what happens to you. You can't prevent every possible bad outcome. You can't gather enough information to eliminate all uncertainty. And trying to do these things will drive you crazy and still leave you feeling afraid. The safety that Jesus offers is different. It's not based on your ability to manage your circumstances. It's based on his ability to hold you regardless of what your circumstances are. It's not about having all the answers. It's about being connected to someone who does. It's not about being strong enough to handle anything. It's about being held by someone who is. Now let me show you exactly how this works in real life, because the difference between knowing about this promise and actually experiencing it comes down to 3 specific steps. 3 ways of thinking and responding that you can practice starting right now, today, in whatever situation is causing you fear. The first step is what I call acknowledge and redirect. When fear shows up, instead of fighting it or trying to make it go away, you acknowledge its presence and then redirect your attention to the promise. It sounds like this: I notice that I'm feeling afraid right now. This fear is trying to protect me, but I don't need to carry this burden alone. Jesus, I'm choosing to rest in your promise that I'm safe in your arms. This isn't about pretending you're not afraid. It's about being honest about your fear while choosing to focus on something bigger than your fear. You're not trying to make the fear disappear. You're choosing to let it be there while you anchor yourself to something more solid than your emotions. The second step is breathe into the promise. Fear creates physical tension in your body. Your muscles tighten, your breathing becomes shallow, your heart rate increases. Instead of fighting these physical responses, you use them as reminders to connect with God's presence. You take slow, deep breaths while mentally repeating a truth about his protection over you. One of my favorite phrases to use is, "In him I live and move and have my being." With each inhale, I imagine breathing in his peace. With each exhale, I imagine releasing my need to control the situation. This isn't just a mental exercise, it's a way of letting your body experience the safety that your mind is choosing to believe. The third step is take the next right step. This is crucial because fear's main goal is to paralyze you, to keep you from moving forward. But once you've acknowledged the fear and connected with God's presence, you take action anyway. Not because you're no longer afraid, but because you're afraid and safe at the same time. This might mean making that phone call you've been avoiding, or having that difficult conversation, or taking that risk you know you need to take. The fear might still be there, but you're no longer controlled by it. You're moving forward from a place of safety instead of a place of panic. I remember using this process when I had to make a major decision about my treatment. The doctors presented me with 2 options, both with significant risks. My mind immediately went into overdrive, trying to research every possible outcome, trying to figure out which choice would guarantee the best result. But the more information I gathered, the more afraid I became. Finally, I stopped trying to figure it all out and applied these 3 steps. I acknowledged that I was terrified of making the wrong choice. I breathed into the promise that God was with me regardless of what happened. And then I took the next right step, which was to make a decision based on wisdom rather than fear, trusting that even if things didn't go perfectly, I would still be held by someone bigger than my circumstances. That experience taught me something profound about the nature of safety. Real safety isn't about knowing how everything will turn out. It's about knowing that you're not facing the unknown alone. It's not about having guarantees. It's about having a relationship with someone who is present in every guarantee and every uncertainty alike. This is what it means to be safe in his arms. Not protected from every storm, but held through every storm. Not immune to difficulty, but never abandoned in difficulty. Not guaranteed easy answers, but promised that you're never facing hard questions alone. And the more you practice this, the more natural it becomes. What used to trigger hours of anxiety starts to become an opportunity to experience God's faithfulness. What used to send you into panic mode starts to become a chance to discover how deep His peace really goes. What used to feel like evidence that you're not safe starts to become proof of how safe you actually are. But I want to address something that might be bothering you right now. Maybe you're thinking, this sounds great in theory, but what about real emergencies? What about situations where I actually am in danger? This is a fair question, and it gets to the heart of what safety really means. Physical safety and spiritual safety are two different things, but they're more connected than most people realize. When Jesus promised that we could be safe in His arms, He wasn't promising that nothing bad would ever happen to our bodies. He was promising something far more profound and lasting. He was promising that our deepest identity, our eternal security, our core sense of being loved and protected could never be touched by external circumstances. Think about the martyrs throughout history, people who faced torture, persecution, even death, yet maintained an unshakable peace. Were they physically safe? No. But they had access to safety so deep, so fundamental, that even the threat of death couldn't disturb it. They had discovered what it means to be held by someone whose love is stronger than any force that could be used against them. This doesn't mean we ignore wisdom or take unnecessary risks. God gave us brains and instincts for a reason. If you're walking alone at night and hear footsteps behind you, you should absolutely trust that instinct and get to safety. If you're facing a medical emergency, you should absolutely seek proper treatment. Common sense and spiritual faith aren't opposites, they work together. But here's what changes when you understand true safety. You stop living your entire life as if you're in constant physical danger. You stop making decisions based on fear of worst-case scenarios that probably will never happen. You stop sacrificing opportunities for growth and connection because you're so focused on protecting yourself from things that might hurt you. I had a client named Michael who was so afraid of car accidents that he hadn't driven in over 5 years. He was taking buses everywhere, turning down job opportunities, missing family gatherings, all because he was convinced that if he got behind the wheel, something terrible would happen. His fear had grown so large that it was controlling every aspect of his life. When we started working together, Michael's first response was, "But car accidents really do happen. People really do die in crashes. How can you tell me I'm safe when that's statistically possible?" And he was right. Car accidents do happen. But living his entire life around the possibility of a car accident was destroying his actual life right now, today, in ways that were far more certain than any potential accident ever could be. Through our work together, Michael learned to distinguish between reasonable precautions and fear-based paralysis. He started wearing his seatbelt, not because he was terrified, but because it was wise. He drove carefully, not because he was panicked, but because he respected the responsibility. And most importantly, he got back in the car, not because driving was perfectly safe, but because he had found a safety that was bigger than the risk. The breakthrough came when Michael realized that his obsession with avoiding car accidents hadn't actually made him safer. It had just made him smaller. He had traded the possibility of physical harm for the certainty of a limited life. And when he found his security in God's promises instead of in his ability to control every outcome, he was able to engage with life fully again while still being appropriately careful. This is the paradox of real safety. When you stop trying to protect yourself from everything that could possibly go wrong, you actually become more capable of handling the things that do go wrong. When you're not constantly braced for disaster, you have more energy and clarity to respond wisely when challenges actually arise. But let me tell you about the most dangerous trap that people fall into when they start understanding these concepts. They think that trusting God means they should never feel afraid, never take precautions, never use their judgment about potentially risky situations. They confuse faith with foolishness, and that's not what Jesus taught at all. When Jesus sent his disciples out to spread the gospel, he didn't tell them to walk into dangerous situations unprepared. He told them to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. He wanted them to be spiritually trusting, but practically smart. He wanted them to rely on God's protection while also using the wisdom God had given them. The same principle applies to your life. Being safe in his arms doesn't mean you stop looking both ways before crossing the street. It doesn't mean you ignore red flags in relationships or make impulsive financial decisions or neglect your health, because God will take care of everything. That's not faith, that's presumption, and it often leads to exactly the kind of consequences that make people lose trust in God's goodness. Real faith looks like this. You take reasonable precautions because you're wise, but you don't live in constant anxiety about all the things you can't control. You plan for the future because you're responsible, but you don't obsess over every possible negative outcome. You pay attention to warning signs because you're alert, but you don't interpret every uncertainty as evidence that disaster is coming. It's the difference between being prepared and being consumed. It's the difference between being cautious and being paralyzed. It's the difference between respecting real danger and creating imaginary danger everywhere you look. I learned this distinction during a hiking trip I took about 6 months after my diagnosis. My doctor had cleared me for physical activity, but I was still recovering my confidence. The trail was well marked and relatively easy, but there were sections that required careful footing, and there was always the possibility of wildlife encounters or sudden weather changes. The old me would have either stayed home entirely or spent the entire hike scanning for every possible threat, turning what should have been a peaceful experience into an exercise in hypervigilance. But I had been practicing these principles of supernatural safety, so I approached it differently. I prepared appropriately. I brought water, snacks, a first aid kit, and told someone where I was going. I checked the weather forecast and chose a trail that matched my current fitness level. But once I was on the trail, instead of constantly looking for things to worry about, I focused on the beauty around me and the sense of God's presence in creation. When my mind started to spin stories about what could go wrong, I used the 3-step process. I acknowledged the fear without fighting it. I breathed into the promise that I was held and protected, and I took the next right step, which was usually just putting one foot in front of the other while staying present to the actual experience I was having rather than the imaginary disasters my mind wanted to create. That hike became a turning point for me, not because nothing challenging happened. I did take a wrong turn at one point and had to backtrack, and there was a moment when I slipped on some loose rocks and scraped my knee. But instead of these minor difficulties confirming my fears, they became opportunities to experience how held I really was, even in moments of uncertainty or discomfort. I realized that safety isn't the absence of all risk or difficulty. Safety is the presence of someone who is with you in every risk and through every difficulty. It's not about living in a bubble where nothing can touch you. It's about living with such deep trust in God's love and protection that you can engage fully with life, including its uncertainties and challenges. This understanding completely transforms how you approach decisions that involve risk. Instead of asking, What if something bad happens? You start asking, what is God calling me to do? And how can I do it wisely while trusting Him with the outcomes I can't control? Instead of avoiding every situation where you can't guarantee the results, you start evaluating opportunities based on wisdom, calling, and faith rather than fear. Instead of making decisions designed to minimize all possible negative consequences, you start making decisions designed to maximize your ability to live the life God has called you to live. Let me give you a practical example. Sarah was offered a promotion at work that would require her to relocate to a different city. It was an incredible opportunity, exactly the kind of role she had been working toward for years. But it would mean leaving behind her support system, taking her kids away from their friends, and moving to a place where she didn't know anyone. The old Sarah would have made a list of everything that could go wrong with the move and probably talked herself out of it. The new Sarah, the one who had learned what it means to be safe in God's arms, approached the decision completely differently. She prayed about it extensively, seeking God's guidance rather than her own ability to predict and control outcomes. She researched the new city thoroughly, not from a place of anxiety, but from a place of wise preparation. She had honest conversations with her children about the challenges and opportunities the move would present. She consulted with mentors and friends whose judgment she trusted. But most importantly, she made the decision from a place of rest rather than a place of fear. She chose to take the job not because she was certain everything would work out perfectly, but because she felt called to this new opportunity and trusted that God would be with her family regardless of how the transition went. The move wasn't without challenges. There were moments of loneliness, difficulties with the kids' adjustment, and unexpected complications with the new role. But because Sarah had made the decision from a place of safety rather than fear, she was able to navigate these challenges with grace and wisdom instead of panic and regret. She later told me, "I realized that I had been making decisions my whole life based on trying to avoid problems rather than trying to follow God's leading. And the crazy thing is, avoiding problems didn't actually help me avoid problems. It just made me smaller and more fearful. But when I started making decisions based on trust instead of fear, I found that I could handle problems I never thought I could handle." This is what happens when you truly understand what it means to be safe in His arms. You don't become reckless or naive. You become brave. You don't stop using wisdom. You start using wisdom that's informed by faith rather than controlled by fear. You don't ignore potential difficulties. You face them with a confidence that's rooted in something deeper than your own ability to handle everything perfectly. But I want to address one more misconception that often prevents people from experiencing this kind of safety. Some people think that trusting God means they shouldn't feel sad when bad things happen, or that they should always be happy and peaceful no matter what's going on in their lives. They think that being safe in His arms means they should be emotionally untouchable. This couldn't be further from the truth. Jesus Himself wept when His friend Lazarus died, even though He knew He was about to raise him from the dead. He felt anguish in the Garden of Gethsemane before His crucifixion. He experienced the full range of human emotions, including fear, sadness, and distress. Being safe in God's arms doesn't mean you don't feel difficult emotions. It means you don't have to face those emotions alone. It doesn't mean you're protected from heartbreak. It means you're held through heartbreak. It doesn't mean you never experience loss or disappointment or uncertainty. It means you experience these things in the context of a love that's stronger than any loss, a hope that's more reliable than any disappointment, a security that's deeper than any uncertainty. I think of David in the Psalms, crying out to God in his distress, expressing his fears and complaints and confusion, but always returning to the truth of God's faithfulness. He didn't pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. He brought his real emotions, his real struggles, his real fears to God, and found that God could handle all of it without rejecting him or withdrawing his protection. This is the kind of safety God offers you. Not safety from feeling difficult things, but safety in the midst of feeling difficult things. Not protection from life's storms, but the assurance that you'll never weather those storms alone. Not immunity from suffering, but the promise that no suffering can separate you from his love. And here's what I've discovered after years of living this way. When you stop trying to protect yourself from feeling difficult emotions, when you stop equating safety with constant happiness, you actually become more resilient, not less. You develop what I call emotional courage, the ability to feel whatever you need to feel while remaining anchored to the truth of who God is and how much he loves you. You stop wasting energy trying to avoid sadness and start using that energy to process sadness in healthy ways. You stop running from fear and start walking through fear with someone who is never afraid. You stop pretending you're fine when you're not and start finding genuine comfort for the places where you're genuinely hurting. This kind of authentic safety that includes your whole emotional experience, rather than trying to bypass it, is what allows you to be truly present with other people in their struggles too. When you're not afraid of your own difficult emotions, you don't have to be afraid of other people's difficult emotions either. You can sit with a friend who's grieving without trying to fix their sadness or rush them through their process. You can listen to someone's fears without immediately trying to talk them out of being afraid. You can be present with people in their struggles because you've learned that God is present with you in yours. This is how the promise of safety in his arms becomes not just personal comfort, but a gift you can offer to others. Not by having all the answers or never experiencing difficulties yourself, but by being someone who has learned to rest in God's love, even in the middle of uncertainty and pain. And this brings us to the final piece of understanding what it really means to be safe in his arms. This safety isn't just for you. It's meant to overflow into every relationship you have, every situation you encounter, every challenge you face. When you truly grasp how held and loved and protected you are, it changes not just how you relate to your own fears, but how you relate to everything and everyone around you. You become a safe person for others to be around because you're not constantly looking to them to make you feel secure. You become a calming presence in chaotic situations because you've learned to access peace that doesn't depend on external circumstances. You become someone who can offer hope to people who are struggling because you've discovered hope that can't be shaken by difficult circumstances. This transformation doesn't happen overnight, but it begins the moment you make a radical shift in how you approach the fears that have been controlling your life. Most people spend years trying to manage their anxiety, control their circumstances, and create enough security to finally feel safe. But what if I told you that you've been approaching this completely backward? The breakthrough comes when you stop trying to create safety and start receiving the safety that's already been provided for you. It's the difference between building a fortress to protect yourself and discovering that you've already been living inside an unshakable refuge all along. Let me show you what this looks like through the story of a woman I worked with named Rachel. She came to me after years of struggling with what she called anticipatory anxiety. Every time something good happened in her life, instead of enjoying it, she would immediately start worrying about when it would be taken away. She couldn't celebrate a promotion without wondering if she'd get fired. She couldn't enjoy her children's happiness without imagining all the ways they could be hurt. She couldn't rest in her marriage without creating scenarios where her husband might leave. Rachel had turned worry into a full-time job. She genuinely believed that if she thought through every possible negative outcome, she could somehow prevent them from happening. She was convinced that her anxiety was actually a form of responsibility, a way of protecting the people and things she loved. But instead of creating safety, her constant vigilance was destroying her ability to experience joy, peace, or genuine connection with anyone. When we first started working together, Rachel's immediate response to the idea of resting in God's promises was, "But what if I stop worrying and something terrible happens? What if my anxiety is the only thing standing between my family and disaster?" This is the lie that keeps so many people trapped in cycles of fear, the belief that their worry is somehow protective, that their anxiety serves a useful purpose. Here's the truth that Rachel had to learn, and that you need to understand too. Your worry doesn't prevent bad things from happening. Your anxiety doesn't make you more prepared for difficulties. Your constant mental rehearsal of worst-case scenarios doesn't give you any real advantage when actual problems arise. All it does is rob you of peace in the present moment, while doing absolutely nothing to change future outcomes. Think about it logically. Has worrying about something ever actually prevented it from happening? Has lying awake at night, imagining disasters, ever made you safer during the day? Has rehearsing conversations about conflicts that might never occur ever made you better at handling the conflicts that actually do occur? Of course not. Because worry and wisdom are two completely different things. Wisdom looks at a situation, assesses real risks, takes appropriate precautions, and then moves forward with confidence. Worry looks at a situation, imagines every possible thing that could go wrong, creates elaborate mental movies about disasters that will probably never happen, and then gets stuck in a loop of anxiety that prevents any productive action at all. Rachel's transformation began when she started to distinguish between these two approaches. Instead of asking, "What if something bad happens?" she started asking, "What does wisdom look like in this situation, and how can I trust God with the outcomes I cannot control?" Instead of spending hours imagining future problems, she started practicing what I call present moment awareness. When her mind would start spinning stories about potential disasters, she would bring her attention back to what was actually happening right now, in this moment, and remind herself that right now, in this moment, she was safe. This wasn't about denying reality or pretending that difficult things never happen. It was about refusing to live in imaginary future scenarios that were stealing her ability to experience the actual life she was living today. It was about recognizing that God's grace is sufficient for each day's troubles, but that trying to carry tomorrow's potential troubles along with today's actual responsibilities was more than any human being was designed to handle. The shift happened gradually, but it was profound. Rachel started sleeping better because she wasn't lying awake rehearsing disasters. She started enjoying time with her family because she wasn't constantly scanning for threats to their happiness. She started making decisions based on opportunity and calling rather than fear and worst-case thinking. But here's what surprised Rachel the most. When actual difficulties did arise in her life, she found that she was better equipped to handle them, not worse. Because she hadn't been exhausting herself with imaginary problems, she had energy and clarity to deal with real problems. Because she had been practicing trust in small daily situations, she had built up spiritual muscle that she could access when bigger challenges came along. When her teenage son was diagnosed with a learning disability, instead of spiraling into panic about his future, Rachel was able to focus on getting him the help he needed right now. When her husband lost his job, instead of catastrophizing about financial ruin, she was able to support him emotionally while they worked together on practical solutions. When her own mother was hospitalized with a stroke, instead of falling apart with worry, Rachel was able to be present and helpful during a crisis that would have previously sent her into complete emotional overwhelm. This is what happens when you learn to be genuinely safe in God's arms. You don't become immune to life's challenges. You become equipped to face them from a place of rest rather than a place of panic. You develop what I call crisis resilience, not because you're naturally brave or because you have everything figured out, but because you've learned to lean into a strength that's greater than your own. But let me address something that might be troubling you as you listen to Rachel's story. Maybe you're thinking, that sounds wonderful for her, but my situation is different. My fears are based on real things that have actually happened to me. I'm not just imagining problems. I've lived through genuine trauma, real loss, actual betrayal. How can I trust God to keep me safe when He didn't protect me from those things before? This is one of the most important questions anyone can ask, and it deserves a thoughtful answer. If you've experienced real trauma, real loss, real betrayal, then your fears aren't just anxiety. They're based on lived experience. You've learned that bad things really do happen, that people you trusted really can hurt you, that life really can change in an instant in ways that are devastating and beyond your control. First, I want you to know that your pain is valid. Your fear makes sense. Your caution is understandable. Anyone who has walked through what you've walked through would have similar responses. You're not broken or faithless or weak because you struggle to trust. You're human, and you're responding in very human ways to very real experiences of suffering. But I also want you to know that your past pain, as real and significant as it is, doesn't have to determine your future possibilities. The fact that you weren't protected from certain things in the past doesn't mean you're not safe in God's arms now. And this isn't because God's protection works differently now than it did then. It's because safety in God's arms means something different than what most people think it means. When we talk about being safe in God's arms, we're not talking about being protected from ever experiencing pain, loss, or difficulty again. We're talking about being held by someone whose love is stronger than any pain you've experienced, whose presence is more reliable than any person who has failed you, whose promises are more trustworthy than any circumstance that has disappointed you. It's the difference between being safe from suffering and being safe in suffering. It's the difference between being protected from heartbreak and being held through heartbreak. It's the difference between immunity from life's storms and the assurance that you'll never weather those storms alone. I think of Joseph in the Old Testament, sold into slavery by his own brothers, falsely accused and imprisoned, forgotten by people he had helped. If anyone had reason to believe that God wasn't protecting him, it was Joseph. His life was full of genuine injustice, real betrayal, and circumstances that were completely beyond his control. But years later, when Joseph was finally in a position to take revenge on the brothers who had wronged him, he said something that reveals a profound understanding of what it means to be safe in God's hands. He said, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Joseph didn't deny that harm had been done to him. He didn't pretend that his suffering hadn't been real or painful, but he had discovered that even his worst experiences couldn't separate him from God's love or derail God's purposes for his life. This is the kind of safety that's available to you, regardless of what you've been through. Not safety from all harm, but safety that can transform even harm into something meaningful. Not protection from all loss, but the promise that no loss can rob you of your deepest identity as God's beloved child. Not immunity from all betrayal, but the assurance that there is one who will never betray you, never abandon you, never stop loving you, no matter what anyone else has done. I worked with a man named David, whose story illustrates this beautifully. David had been sexually abused as a child by a trusted family member. The trauma had affected every area of his life. His ability to trust others, his capacity for intimacy, his sense of safety in the world, his relationship with God. For decades, David carried the weight of wondering why a loving God would allow such terrible things to happen to an innocent child. When David first came to see me, he was angry at God, angry at himself, and convinced that the idea of being safe in God's arms was either naive or cruel, given what he had experienced. "Where were God's arms when I needed them most?" he asked. "How can I trust promises about protection from someone who didn't protect me when I was most vulnerable?" David's questions were honest and important, and they deserved more than religious platitudes or easy answers. We spent months exploring his pain, his anger, his sense of betrayal, not just by his abuser, but by God himself. David needed to express his rage at the injustice of what had happened to him before he could even begin to consider the possibility that God might still be trustworthy. Slowly, over time, David began to understand that God's heart had been broken by his suffering too, that God had never intended for children to be harmed, that the abuse David experienced was a result of human evil, not divine will. That God had been present in David's pain, grieving with him, holding him, even when David couldn't feel that presence. But the real breakthrough came when David realized that his healing and his ability to help other survivors was actually a form of God's protection working in his life, even decades after the original trauma. Not protection from the abuse, that hadn't happened, but protection of his deepest identity, his capacity for compassion, his ability to find meaning and purpose even in the midst of profound suffering. David started volunteering with an organization that helps child abuse survivors. He discovered that his own experience, as painful as it had been, gave him a unique ability to connect with and encourage others who were walking similar paths. He found that God was using his greatest wound to become his greatest ministry. This didn't erase the pain of what had happened to him. David still struggles with trust issues. He still has difficult days when the trauma feels fresh and overwhelming. But he has found a safety that his abuser couldn't touch, a love that his trauma couldn't destroy, a purpose that his pain couldn't prevent. David learned that being safe in God's arms doesn't mean you're protected from all harm. It means that no harm can ultimately defeat you. It doesn't mean you won't experience injustice. It means that injustice won't have the final word in your story. It doesn't mean you won't face seasons of darkness. It means that darkness will never be able to extinguish the light that God has placed within you. If you've experienced trauma, abuse, betrayal, or profound loss, I want you to know that your story isn't over. The harm that was done to you was real, and it matters, and it was wrong. But it doesn't define you, and it doesn't disqualify you from experiencing the safety and love that God offers. In fact, it might be exactly what qualifies you to understand that safety in a way that people who haven't suffered deeply simply cannot. Your scars don't make you broken. They make you someone who can offer hope to others who are wounded. Your struggles don't disqualify you from God's love. They demonstrate how powerful that love is when it can hold you and heal you and use you despite everything you've been through. This brings us to a crucial understanding about fear that most people never grasp. Fear often isn't really about future events at all. It's about past events that haven't been properly processed or healed. When you're afraid of being hurt again, you're not just responding to present circumstances. You're responding to memories of past pain that your nervous system is trying to protect you from experiencing again. This is why some people can face objectively dangerous situations with calm courage, while others are paralyzed by fears that seem completely irrational. It's not about the actual level of threat in the present moment. It's about what past experiences have taught their bodies to perceive as dangerous. If you've been betrayed by someone you trusted, your nervous system might interpret any vulnerability as life-threatening danger. If you've experienced financial instability, any uncertainty about money might trigger overwhelming anxiety. If you've lost someone you loved unexpectedly, any situation where you can't control outcomes might feel unbearably threatening. Understanding this changes everything about how you approach healing from fear. Instead of just trying to manage present anxiety, you start addressing the root experiences that are driving that anxiety. Instead of just learning coping techniques, you start processing the unresolved pain that's making coping necessary in the first place. This is where the promise of being safe in God's arms becomes incredibly practical and powerful. Because God doesn't just offer you safety from future harm, He offers you healing from past harm. He doesn't just promise to protect you going forward, He promises to redeem what you've already been through. This redemption doesn't happen all at once, and it doesn't erase the reality of what you've experienced, but it does something even more profound. It transforms your relationship with your own story. Instead of being defined by what was done to you, you start being defined by how God is working through you. Instead of being imprisoned by your past, you start finding freedom to create a different future. I've seen this happen countless times with people who thought their trauma disqualified them from ever feeling truly safe. A woman who was sexually assaulted becomes an advocate for other survivors and discovers that her voice is powerful precisely because of what she's overcome. A man who grew up in an abusive home becomes a foster parent and creates the safe environment for children that he never had. A person who lost a child to illness starts a support group for grieving parents and finds that their deepest pain becomes their greatest source of compassion for others. This is what it looks like to be safe in God's arms, even after experiencing the worst that life has to offer. It's not safety from suffering. That ship may have already sailed. It's safety in suffering, safety through suffering, and ultimately safety that can transform suffering into something meaningful and beautiful. But I want to be very clear about something. This process of healing and redemption isn't something you can rush or force. You can't just decide to get over trauma or move on from significant losses. Healing happens in God's timing, not according to your schedule or anyone else's expectations. If you're in the early stages of processing difficult experiences, your primary job isn't to find meaning in your suffering or to help other people or to be grateful for what you've learned. Your primary job is simply to survive, to get through each day, to allow yourself to feel whatever you need to feel without judgment. Being safe in God's arms in those early stages might just mean knowing that it's okay to be angry, okay to be confused, okay to question everything you thought you believed. It might mean having permission to grieve for as long as you need to grieve, to be weak when you need to be weak, to not have answers when everyone around you seems to want you to have figured everything out. God can handle your anger. He can handle your doubts. He can handle your accusations and your silence and your desperate bargaining and your complete emotional exhaustion. His arms are strong enough to hold you even when you're not sure you want to be held, even when you're pushing away from him because you're not sure he can be trusted. This is perhaps the most important thing I can tell you about what it means to be safe in God's arms. His love for you isn't conditional on your faith being strong, or your attitude being positive, or your responses being appropriate. His love for you is based on who he is, not on who you are, or what you've done, or what's been done to you. You don't have to clean yourself up before you come to him. You don't have to have your theology figured out before you can experience his comfort. You don't have to forgive people who have hurt you before you can receive his forgiveness and healing. You can come exactly as you are, with all your pain and anger and confusion and fear, and find that his arms are already open to receive you. This radical acceptance is what begins to heal the deepest levels of fear and insecurity. When you discover that you're loved and held and valued, not because of your performance, but because of his character, it changes your entire relationship with uncertainty and risk. You stop needing to be perfect to feel worthy of protection. You stop needing to have all the answers to feel secure in his love. You stop needing to control every outcome to feel safe in his presence. You discover that his acceptance of you is so complete, so unconditional, so unshakable, that you can finally stop trying to earn what you already have and start learning to rest in what you've already been given. This rest, this deep soul rest that comes from knowing you're completely loved and absolutely safe, regardless of your circumstances, is what transforms how you approach every area of your life. It changes how you handle stress at work because you're no longer trying to prove your worth through your achievements. It changes how you navigate relationships because you're no longer looking to other people to provide the security that only God can provide. It changes how you make decisions because you're no longer driven by fear of making mistakes or fear of other people's disapproval. When you know you're safe in God's arms, you become free to take risks that align with His calling on your life. You become free to love people deeply, even though love always involves the possibility of loss. You become free to use your gifts and talents boldly, even though success is never guaranteed. You become free to be authentically yourself, even though not everyone will understand or approve. This freedom isn't recklessness, it's courage. It's the ability to move forward in faith, even when you can't see all the outcomes, even when you don't have all the information, even when you can't control all the variables. It's the confidence that comes from knowing that your ultimate security doesn't depend on your ability to manage your circumstances perfectly. And here's what I've discovered after years of helping people find this kind of supernatural safety. The people who are most free, most joyful, most impactful in their relationships and communities aren't the people who have experienced the least difficulty. They're the people who have learned to find safety in God's love even in the midst of difficulty. They're not the people who have the most control over their circumstances. They're the people who have learned to trust someone who is bigger than any circumstance they could ever face. They're not the people who never feel afraid. They're the people who have learned to feel afraid and choose faith anyway, to experience uncertainty and rest in God's certainty, to face the unknown while holding onto the hand of someone who knows everything. This is the invitation that's available to you right now, today, regardless of what you've been through or what you're currently facing. Not an invitation to a life without challenges, but an invitation to face those challenges from a place of unshakable security. Not a promise that everything will always work out the way you want it to, but a promise that you'll never have to face anything alone. The question isn't whether you're worthy of this kind of safety. You are, simply because God loves you. The question isn't whether your faith is strong enough. It doesn't have to be, because His faithfulness is strong enough for both of you. The question isn't whether you understand how all of this works. You don't have to understand it to experience it. The only question is whether you're ready to stop trying to create your own safety and start receiving the safety that's already been provided for you. Whether you're ready to stop carrying burdens you were never meant to carry and start resting in arms that are strong enough to carry both you and every concern you've been struggling with. Whether you're ready to discover what it really means to be safe, not because your circumstances are controllable, but because you're held by someone who is bigger than any circumstance you could ever face. The moment you make that choice, everything begins to shift. Not instantly, not magically, but steadily and surely, because you're no longer fighting against the current of fear. You're learning to swim in the deeper waters of trust, where the waves of circumstance can't pull you under, because you're anchored to something that goes all the way to the bottom. But let me tell you about the most surprising discovery I made when I first started living this way. I expected that trusting God more would make me softer, more passive, less engaged with the realities of life. I thought that finding safety in His arms would turn me into someone who just accepted whatever happened without trying to change anything or improve any situation. What actually happened was the complete opposite. When I stopped spending all my emotional energy trying to protect myself from every possible threat, I suddenly had tremendous energy available for actually engaging with the life God had given me. When I stopped being paralyzed by fear of making wrong decisions, I became much more decisive and effective in the decisions I did make. It's like the difference between a person who's drowning and a person who knows how to swim. The drowning person uses every ounce of energy just trying to keep their head above water. They can't help anyone else, can't enjoy the experience, can't even see the beauty around them because they're so focused on survival. But the person who knows how to swim can relax in the water, help others who are struggling, appreciate the scenery, and actually accomplish things while they're in the water. That's what happens when you learn to rest in God's arms. You stop using all your energy just trying to survive emotionally, and you start having energy available for thriving, for serving others, for pursuing the purposes God has given you. You stop being so focused on protecting yourself that you can't see opportunities to make a difference in the world around you. I remember the first time I really understood this. It was about 8 months after my health crisis, and I was at a coffee shop working on a presentation for a conference where I had been invited to speak about overcoming anxiety. At the table next to me, a young mother was on the phone, clearly in distress. Her voice was shaking as she talked to what sounded like a doctor's office, trying to schedule some kind of test for her child. The old me would have immediately started imagining all the reasons why she might be upset, creating stories in my mind about what could be wrong with her child, and then spiraling into anxiety about my own health or the health of people I loved. I would have been so triggered by her distress that I would have had to leave the coffee shop just to manage my own emotional reaction. But that day, something different happened. I felt compassion for her without absorbing her anxiety. I said a quiet prayer for her and her family without taking on the burden of worrying about their situation. And when she got off the phone and I could see that she was crying, I was able to approach her gently and ask if she needed anything, if there was some way I could help. It turned out that her 3-year-old son needed some routine tests that the doctor had recommended, and she was overwhelmed trying to coordinate the appointments while managing her work schedule and her other children. It wasn't a crisis, but it felt overwhelming to her because she was already stretched thin and didn't have much support. I was able to recommend a pediatrician I knew who was particularly good with young children and anxious parents. I gave her the names of a couple of babysitters who might be able to help with her other kids during the appointments. We talked for maybe 10 minutes, and by the time I left, she was smiling and seemed so much more hopeful about managing the situation. Later, as I was driving home, I realized what had happened. Because I wasn't consumed with my own fears and anxieties, I had been available to be genuinely helpful to someone else who was struggling. Because I had learned to find my security in God rather than in controlling my circumstances, I had emotional and mental space to notice when someone needed encouragement and practical help. This wasn't about being a hero or doing something extraordinary. It was just about being present and available in a moment when someone needed a little support. But I realized that for most of my adult life, I had been too wrapped up in my own anxieties to be truly present for other people in their moments of need. Fear makes you incredibly self-focused, not because you're selfish, but because fear tells you that you're in constant danger and need to be vigilant about protecting yourself at all times. When you're living in that state, you don't have much capacity to notice what's happening with other people, let alone respond with wisdom and compassion. But when you know you're safe in God's arms, when you've experienced that deep security that doesn't depend on having everything under control, you become free to notice and respond to the needs around you. You become someone who can offer stability to others because you've found stability yourself. You become someone who can speak peace into chaotic situations because you've learned to access peace that doesn't depend on external circumstances. This is one of the most beautiful aspects of learning to live in supernatural safety. It's not just about your own comfort and peace of mind, though those things matter. It's about becoming the kind of person who makes the world a safer place for others. When you're no longer driven by your own fears, you become someone who can help other people process their fears. When you've learned to trust God in uncertainty, you become someone who can encourage others to take steps of faith, even when they can't see all the outcomes. Let me tell you about Maria, a woman I worked with who discovered this in a powerful way. Maria had struggled with social anxiety for most of her life. She was terrified of saying the wrong thing, of being judged or rejected, of not being smart enough or interesting enough for other people to want to spend time with her. As a result, she had very few close friendships and often felt lonely and isolated. When Maria started learning about what it means to be safe in God's arms, her first instinct was to focus on how this could help her feel less anxious in social situations. And it did help with that. As she began to understand that her worth and identity were secure in God's love, she became less desperate for other people's approval. As she experienced God's acceptance of her, she became less afraid of other people's potential rejection. But something else began to happen that Maria hadn't expected. As her own social anxiety decreased, she started noticing other people who seemed to be struggling with similar issues. She began to see the subtle signs of insecurity and fear that she had been too focused on her own anxiety to notice before. There was the new person at work who ate lunch alone every day, not because she was antisocial, but because she seemed too nervous to join any of the established groups. There was the woman at church who always arrived late and left early, avoiding the social time before and after the service. There was the neighbor who would wave politely, but always seemed to deflect any attempts at deeper conversation. Because Maria had learned what it felt like to be genuinely accepted and safe, she began to have compassion for others who were still searching for that same sense of belonging. And because she was no longer consumed with managing her own social fears, she had emotional space to reach out to people who seemed isolated or anxious. Maria started small. She invited the new co-worker to join her for lunch. She made a point of arriving early at church and introducing herself to people who seemed to be standing alone. She baked cookies for her neighbor and used that as an excuse to have a longer conversation. None of these actions required Maria to become an extrovert or to completely overcome her natural tendency toward introversion, but they did require her to act from a place of security rather than a place of fear. Instead of being so worried about whether people would like her that she couldn't reach out to anyone, she started reaching out to people precisely because she knew that her worth didn't depend on their response. The transformation was remarkable, both for Maria and for the people she began connecting with. She discovered that many people were just as lonely and insecure as she had been, but they were all too afraid to make the first move toward genuine connection. When someone was willing to reach out with authentic interest and acceptance, most people responded with gratitude and relief. Within a year, Maria had developed several meaningful friendships and had become known in her workplace and church community as someone who was particularly good at making new people feel welcome. She started volunteering with a group that helped people who were new to the city get connected with community resources and social opportunities. What struck me most about Maria's story was how naturally this transformation had occurred. She hadn't set out to become a community builder or to help other people with social anxiety. She had simply learned to find her security in God's love, and that security had naturally overflowed into care and concern for others who were struggling in similar ways. This is what happens when you truly understand what it means to be safe in God's arms. Your own healing becomes a source of healing for others. Your own peace becomes a gift you can offer to people who are still searching for peace. Your own security becomes a foundation from which you can help others find their security. But let me address something that might be troubling you as you think about this. Maybe you're wondering, if I stop being afraid, if I stop worrying about everything that could go wrong, will I become complacent? Will I stop working hard, stop being responsible, stop caring about important things? This is a fear that many people have when they first start considering what it might be like to live without constant anxiety. They've been driven by fear for so long that they can't imagine being motivated by anything else. They worry that if they stop being afraid of failure, they'll stop trying to succeed. If they stop worrying about their children, they'll stop being good parents. If they stop being anxious about their work, they'll stop being productive employees. But here's what I've discovered, both in my own life and in the lives of hundreds of people I've worked with. Fear is actually a terrible motivator for long-term success and fulfillment. When you're driven primarily by fear, you make decisions based on avoiding negative outcomes rather than pursuing positive possibilities. You're reactive rather than proactive. You're defensive rather than creative. Think about the difference between studying for a test because you're afraid of failing and studying for a test because you're excited about learning. The person who's afraid of failing might work hard, but they're tense, anxious, and focused primarily on avoiding mistakes. The person who's excited about learning is relaxed, curious, and focused on understanding and growth. Which person do you think is likely to perform better, not just on the test, but in their overall relationship with learning? The same principle applies to every area of life. When you're motivated by love rather than fear, by purpose rather than anxiety, by faith rather than worry, you become more effective, not less. You make better decisions because you're not operating from a state of panic. You're more creative because you're not constantly focused on what could go wrong. You're more resilient because you're not exhausting yourself with constant vigilance. I learned this firsthand when I started my own business several years ago. For the first few months, I was driven almost entirely by fear. Fear of failing, fear of not making enough money, fear of what people would think if my business didn't succeed. I worked incredibly long hours, but most of that time was spent worrying rather than doing productive work. I was so afraid of making mistakes that I procrastinated on important decisions. I was so focused on worst-case scenarios that I missed opportunities that were right in front of me. It wasn't until I learned to find my security in God's promises rather than in my business outcomes that I started making real progress. When I stopped working from a place of desperation and started working from a place of calling, everything changed. I became more focused, more decisive, more willing to take calculated risks that could lead to growth. This didn't mean I stopped caring about whether my business succeeded. It meant I cared about it in a healthier way. Instead of being driven by fear of failure, I was motivated by excitement about the impact I could have. Instead of being paralyzed by uncertainty, I was energized by the adventure of building something meaningful. Instead of being exhausted by constant worry, I was sustained by the knowledge that my ultimate security didn't depend on any particular business outcome. The business became more successful, but more importantly, I became more successful as a person. I was healthier, happier, more present in my relationships, more generous with my time and resources. I had learned that when you find your safety in God's arms, you don't become less motivated. You become motivated by better things. This shift from fear-based motivation to love-based motivation is one of the most liberating experiences you can have. Instead of being driven by what you're trying to avoid, you start being drawn by what you're trying to create. Instead of making decisions based on worst-case scenarios, you start making decisions based on best-case possibilities. Instead of being paralyzed by the thought of making mistakes, you become willing to take risks because you know that your worth and security don't depend on never failing. Let me give you a practical example of what this looks like. Sarah was a perfectionist who had built her entire identity around never making mistakes. She was successful in her career, but she was miserable because she lived in constant fear of being found out as inadequate. She worked excessive hours, double and triple-checked everything she did, and avoided taking on new challenges because she was terrified of not being able to perform perfectly. When Sarah started learning about finding her security in God's love rather than in her performance, her first fear was that she would become lazy or careless. She was convinced that her perfectionism was the only thing standing between her and complete failure. She thought that if she stopped being afraid of making mistakes, she would start making mistakes constantly. What actually happened was completely different. As Sarah began to understand that her worth wasn't dependent on her performance, she started taking more creative risks in her work. She volunteered for projects that stretched her abilities because she was no longer paralyzed by the possibility of not doing them perfectly. She started speaking up in meetings with innovative ideas because she was no longer terrified of saying something that might be wrong. Paradoxically, as Sarah became less afraid of making mistakes, she actually started making fewer mistakes. When you're not operating from a state of anxiety, your mind is clearer and your judgment is better. When you're not exhausting yourself with perfectionist behaviors, you have more energy available for doing excellent work. When you're not paralyzed by fear of failure, you're more willing to learn from feedback and continuously improve. Within 2 years, Sarah had been promoted twice and was leading a team of people who consistently exceeded their goals. But more importantly, she was enjoying her work in a way she never had before. She was sleeping better, had more energy for her relationships, and had developed hobbies and interests outside of work that brought her joy and fulfillment. Sarah's transformation illustrates a crucial principle about living safely in God's arms. When you find your identity and security in His love rather than in your achievements, you don't become less successful. You become successful in a more sustainable, joyful, and meaningful way. You stop measuring success only by external outcomes and start measuring it by internal qualities like peace, purpose, and the positive impact you're having on others. This doesn't mean you stop setting goals or working hard or caring about results. It means you care about these things from a place of love and calling rather than from a place of fear and desperation. It means you pursue excellence because you want to use your gifts well, not because you're terrified of being seen as inadequate. It means you work diligently because you're excited about the contribution you can make, not because you're panicked about the consequences of not working hard enough. And here's what's beautiful about this shift. When you're working from a place of love rather than fear, when you're motivated by purpose rather than anxiety, other people can sense the difference. You become more attractive as a colleague, a friend, a leader, because people are drawn to those who operate from a place of security and confidence rather than from a place of desperation and need. You become someone who can encourage others when they're struggling because you're not consumed with your own struggles. You become someone who can take risks and try new things because you're not paralyzed by the possibility of failure. You become someone who can admit mistakes and learn from them because your identity isn't threatened by imperfection. This is leadership at its finest. Not the kind of leadership that comes from being the smartest person in the room, or the most driven, or the most willing to sacrifice everything for success. But the kind of leadership that comes from being secure enough in who you are, that you can focus on bringing out the best in others. The kind of leadership that comes from being so confident in God's love for you that you can love others without needing anything from them in return. I've seen this transformation in so many people over the years. Business owners who went from being anxious micromanagers to being inspiring leaders who empowered their teams. Parents who went from being worried and controlling to being calm and supportive guides for their children. Teachers who went from being stressed about test scores to being passionate about helping students discover their potential. In every case, the change wasn't about becoming less caring or less committed. It was about learning to care and commit from a place of security rather than a place of fear. It was about discovering that when you know you're safe in God's arms, you become free to take the kinds of risks and make the kinds of investments in others that create lasting positive change. But let me tell you about the most profound way that living in supernatural safety transforms your relationships. Because when you're no longer looking to other people to provide the security that only God can provide, you become free to love them in ways that are genuinely selfless and life-giving. Think about the relationships in your life that feel the most draining or complicated. I'm willing to bet that in many of those relationships, there's an underlying dynamic where someone is looking to the other person to provide something that they should be getting from God. Security, validation, purpose, worth, peace. These are things that human beings simply cannot provide for each other in unlimited quantities. When you're looking to your spouse to make you feel completely secure, you put pressure on them that no human being can handle. When you're looking to your children to validate your worth as a parent, you create dynamics that are unhealthy for everyone involved. When you're looking to your friends to meet all your emotional needs, you exhaust them and probably drive them away. But when you learn to find your deepest security in God's love, something beautiful happens in all your human relationships. You stop needing so much from others, which means you have more capacity to give. You stop being so focused on whether people are meeting your needs, which means you become more aware of their needs. You stop being driven by fear of rejection or abandonment, which means you can love more freely and authentically. I experienced this transformation most dramatically in my marriage. For years, I had looked to my husband to provide a level of emotional security that was simply impossible for any human being to provide. When he was stressed about work, I interpreted it as evidence that he didn't love me enough. When he needed space to process his own thoughts and emotions, I felt rejected and abandoned. When he couldn't read my mind and anticipate my needs, I felt unloved and unimportant. The pressure this put on our relationship was enormous. My husband felt like he could never do enough to make me feel secure, and I felt like he was constantly disappointing me by not being able to meet needs that I didn't even fully understand myself. We were both exhausted by the cycle of my anxiety and his attempts to reassure me, followed by my continued anxiety, because human reassurance can never fully satisfy the need for divine security. Everything changed when I learned to bring my deepest needs for security and validation to God instead of to my husband. This didn't happen overnight, and it required me to recognize patterns of thinking and behavior that I had been unconscious of for years. But as I began to experience genuine safety in God's arms, I found that I needed less and less from my husband in terms of constant reassurance and validation. This didn't make me love him less, it made me love him better. Instead of loving him because of what he could do for me, I started loving him because of who he was. Instead of being focused on whether he was meeting my needs, I became more aware of his needs and more capable of meeting them. Instead of being afraid that he might leave me or stop loving me, I became secure enough in God's love to give him the freedom to be himself without trying to control his feelings or responses. The transformation in our marriage was remarkable. When I stopped being so needy and desperate for his approval, he actually started giving me more affection and attention, not because I was demanding it, but because he wanted to. When I stopped interpreting every mood or distraction as a threat to our relationship, he felt safer being honest with me about his struggles and concerns. When I stopped trying to control his emotions and responses, he became more generous with both. This is what happens in every relationship when you learn to find your security in God rather than in other people. You become someone who is safe to be around because you're not constantly looking for validation or reassurance. You become someone who can handle other people's emotions without taking them personally or trying to fix them immediately. You become someone who can give love without keeping score of what you're getting in return. Your friendships become deeper because you're not competing with your friends or using them to meet needs they were never meant to meet. Your parenting becomes more effective because you're not trying to live through your children or using their behavior to validate your worth as a parent. Your work relationships become more productive because you're not constantly worried about whether people like you or approve of your performance. But perhaps most importantly, you become someone who can model what it looks like to live from a place of security rather than a place of fear. Your relationships become laboratories where other people can experience what it feels like to be around someone who isn't driven by anxiety, who isn't desperate for approval, who isn't threatened by differences of opinion or conflicting needs. This kind of relational transformation is one of the most powerful ways that learning to be safe in God's arms impacts not just your own life, but the lives of everyone around you. When people experience unconditional acceptance and genuine security in relationship with you, it gives them a taste of what God's love feels like. It creates space for them to consider the possibility that they too could find a safety that doesn't depend on managing their circumstances or controlling other people's responses. I think of the ripple effect that happens when even one person in a family system learns to live this way. Children who grow up with a parent who has found their security in God, rather than in their children's behavior, develop much healthier patterns of self-worth and relationship. Spouses who experience unconditional love from a partner who has learned to find their deepest needs met in God often discover their own capacity for that kind of love. Friends who spend time with someone who operates from genuine security often find themselves feeling more secure and less anxious just by association. This is the multiplication effect of supernatural safety. When you discover what it means to be truly held and loved and protected by God, that discovery doesn't just change your own experience of life. It changes your capacity to create safety and security for others. You become a person who makes the world a safer place, not by controlling external circumstances, but by bringing the peace and security you've found in God into every situation and relationship you encounter. And this brings us to what might be the most important question of all. If all of this is true, if this kind of supernatural safety is really available, if it can really transform your experience of fear and uncertainty and difficulty, then why do so many people continue to live in anxiety and insecurity? Why don't more people know about this? Why isn't everyone walking around with this kind of unshakable peace? The answer is both simple and complex. It's simple because there's really only one thing standing between you and this experience of safety. You have to choose it. You have to decide to stop trying to create your own security and start receiving the security that God has already provided. You have to choose to trust His promises even when your circumstances seem to contradict them. You have to choose to rest in His arms even when your emotions are telling you that you're not safe. But it's also complex because making that choice consistently, especially when you've spent years or decades operating from fear and anxiety, requires a fundamental rewiring of how you think and respond to uncertainty. It requires you to go against every instinct that tells you that your safety depends on your ability to control, predict, and manage your circumstances. Most people want the peace and security that comes from trusting God, but they want it without having to give up their illusion of control. They want to feel safe, but they also want to maintain their backup plans and their emergency strategies and their elaborate systems for trying to prevent bad things from happening. They want to rest in God's arms, but they also want to keep one foot on the ground in case His arms aren't strong enough or reliable enough. But here's what I've learned after years of trying to have it both ways. You can't experience supernatural peace while maintaining natural panic. You can't rest in God's promises while simultaneously hedging your bets with your own backup plans. You can't be safe in His arms while you're still trying to hold on to everything with your own hands. This is why Jesus talked about faith the way He did. He didn't present it as an addition to human wisdom and planning. He presented it as an alternative to human wisdom and planning. He didn't offer it as a supplement to your own efforts to create security. He offered it as a replacement for those efforts. This doesn't mean you become irresponsible or naive. It means you become responsible in a different way. Instead of trying to be responsible for outcomes you can't actually control, you become responsible for trusting the one who can control them. Instead of trying to be wise enough to predict every possible scenario, you become wise enough to depend on someone whose wisdom is perfect. Instead of trying to be strong enough to handle everything yourself, You become strong enough to admit your limitations and rest in someone whose strength never fails. The choice to live this way is one that you have to make not just once, but over and over again, in situation after situation, until it becomes the natural pattern of your heart and mind. Every time fear knocks on the door of your thoughts, every time uncertainty threatens to overwhelm you, every time circumstances tempt you to panic, you have the opportunity to choose safety in God's arms instead of the exhausting alternative of trying to manage everything yourself. And here's what I want you to know as you consider making that choice. You don't have to wait until your faith is perfect, or your understanding is complete, or your circumstances are ideal. You can start right now, today, in whatever situation is currently causing you fear or anxiety. You can begin to practice what it means to acknowledge your limitations, trust God's promises, and take the next right step from a place of rest rather than a place of panic. You can start small. The next time you feel that familiar tightness in your chest when you think about an uncertain situation, instead of immediately going into problem-solving mode or worst-case scenario planning, you can pause and say, God, I don't know how this is going to work out, but I trust that you do. Help me rest in your promises instead of wrestling with my fears. You can practice this when you're lying awake at night worried about tomorrow's presentation. You can practice it when you're waiting for test results from your doctor. You can practice it when your teenager is out past curfew and isn't answering their phone. You can practice it when your bank account is lower than you're comfortable with and bills are due. You can practice it in all the small daily moments of uncertainty that used to send you into spirals of anxiety. And here's what will happen as you practice this consistently. Those neural pathways in your brain that have been trained to respond to uncertainty with panic will slowly begin to change. New pathways will develop that connect uncertain circumstances with God's faithfulness instead of with catastrophic thinking. Your nervous system will begin to learn that uncertainty doesn't equal danger, that not knowing all the outcomes doesn't mean you're not safe. This isn't just spiritual theory. This is actually how your brain works. Neuroscientists have discovered that our brains are incredibly adaptable throughout our entire lives. The patterns of thinking and responding that feel so automatic and unchangeable can actually be rewired through consistent practice of new patterns. When you repeatedly choose to respond to fear with faith, to uncertainty with trust, to anxiety with rest in God's promises, you're literally creating new neural pathways that make those responses more natural and automatic over time. But I want to be honest with you about what this process looks like. It's not a smooth, linear progression from fear to faith. There will be days when you feel like you've made tremendous progress, when you handle a stressful situation with remarkable peace and trust. And then there will be other days when a relatively small uncertainty sends you right back into old patterns of worry and anxiety, and you'll wonder if you've learned anything at all. This is completely normal and part of the process. Think of it like learning to play a musical instrument or developing any other skill. Some days your fingers find the right notes easily, and some days you feel like you're all thumbs. Some days the music flows naturally, and some days everything sounds discordant and frustrating. But if you keep practicing consistently, over time, the good days become more frequent, and the difficult days become less overwhelming. The same is true with learning to live in supernatural safety. Some days you'll feel deeply anchored in God's love and promises, able to face uncertainty with genuine peace. Other days, you'll find yourself slipping back into old patterns of trying to control everything and worrying about outcomes you can't influence. The key is to be patient with yourself during the learning process and to remember that every time you choose trust over fear, even imperfectly, you're strengthening spiritual muscles that will serve you for the rest of your life. I remember a conversation I had with my mentor during a particularly difficult season of this learning process. I was frustrated because I felt like I kept having the same struggles with anxiety over and over again, even though I intellectually understood God's promises and had experienced His faithfulness many times. I felt like I should be further along in my spiritual maturity than I was. My mentor listened patiently to my frustration and then asked me a question that changed my perspective completely. She said, "Sarah, when you were learning to walk as a toddler, did you get frustrated with yourself every time you fell down? Did you consider quitting because walking wasn't immediately easy and natural for you? Of course not. As a toddler, I had fallen down countless times, but each fall had been followed by getting back up and trying again. I hadn't expected to go from crawling to running marathons in a single day. I had understood, at some instinctive level, that learning to walk was a process that required patience, practice, and persistence. Learning to walk in faith is the same way, my mentor continued. You're developing spiritual balance and coordination that you've never had before. You're learning to trust muscles you've never used and to move in ways that don't feel natural yet. Of course, you're going to stumble sometimes. That doesn't mean you're failing. It means you're learning. That conversation gave me permission to be more patient with myself during the learning process. Instead of getting discouraged when I had setbacks, I started viewing them as normal parts of developing spiritual maturity. Instead of expecting perfection immediately, I started celebrating small improvements and incremental progress. This shift in perspective made an enormous difference in my ability to actually make progress. When I wasn't constantly judging myself for not being perfect at faith, I had much more emotional energy available for actually practicing faith. When I stopped treating every moment of fear or uncertainty as evidence that I was spiritually deficient, I became more willing to be honest about my struggles and more open to learning from them. This brings me to something crucial that I wish someone had told me earlier in this journey. The goal isn't to never feel afraid again. The goal is to learn how to feel afraid while simultaneously knowing that you're safe. It's the difference between being controlled by your emotions and being informed by them while remaining anchored to something deeper and more reliable than what you're feeling in any given moment. Fear will still visit you. Anxiety will still knock on your door. Uncertainty will still be part of your daily experience as a human being living in an unpredictable world. But when you've learned to find your safety in God's arms, these experiences lose their power to derail your peace or dictate your decisions. They become temporary weather patterns moving through your emotional landscape rather than permanent storms that define your entire experience of life. I think of it like being in a house during a thunderstorm. When you're outside in the storm, you're completely at the mercy of the weather. The rain soaks you, the wind pushes you around, the lightning terrifies you. But when you're inside a solid house, you can acknowledge that there's a storm outside without being threatened by it. You can even appreciate the power and beauty of the thunder and lightning because you know you're protected from it. That's what it feels like to experience fear while being safe in God's arms. The storm of anxiety or uncertainty might be raging around you, but you're not exposed to it in the same way. You can acknowledge its presence, even respect its intensity, without being overwhelmed or controlled by it. You have a shelter that the storm cannot touch, a foundation that the winds cannot shake. But let me address something that might be bothering you as you think about this house analogy. You might be wondering, what about when the storms of life are so intense that even houses get destroyed? What about situations like terminal illness or the death of a loved one or catastrophic loss that no amount of faith seems adequate to handle? This is where we need to understand that the safety God offers isn't like a physical house that can be damaged or destroyed by external forces. It's more like being held by someone whose love is stronger than death, whose presence transcends physical circumstances, whose promises extend beyond anything that can happen to your body or your earthly life. I learned this in a way I never expected when my father was diagnosed with late-stage cancer 2 years ago. All my growth in trusting God, all my progress in finding safety in His arms, suddenly felt fragile and inadequate in the face of losing someone I loved so much. The old familiar fears came rushing back with a vengeance. What if the treatments didn't work? What if we didn't have enough time together? What if I wasn't strong enough to handle watching him suffer? For several weeks, I felt like all my spiritual progress had evaporated. I was back to lying awake at night, my mind spinning through worst-case scenarios. I was back to feeling like I needed to research every possible treatment option, to somehow find a way to control an outcome that was ultimately beyond my control. I was disappointed in myself for not being able to maintain the peace I had worked so hard to develop. But then, something shifted. Not because the circumstances changed, but because I remembered that the safety I had found in God's arms was never about being protected from all difficult experiences. It was about being held through all difficult experiences. It was about discovering that even the things I was most afraid of losing couldn't separate me from the love that mattered most. I started spending more intentional time with my father, not frantically trying to cram in as much as possible before it was too late, but peacefully enjoying whatever time we had together. I stopped researching treatments obsessively and started focusing on how I could best support him and my mother during this difficult season. I stopped trying to prepare for every possible scenario and started being present for the actual moments we were sharing. The fear didn't disappear entirely. There were still difficult days when the reality of potentially losing him felt overwhelming. But I found that I could feel sad about the situation while simultaneously feeling held by God. I could acknowledge my grief while also experiencing peace that transcended my circumstances. I could face uncertainty about the future while resting in certainty about God's love and faithfulness. My father's treatment ended up being more successful than the doctors initially expected, and he's doing well today. But even more importantly, I learned that the safety I had found in God's arms was real enough to sustain me, even in situations I had previously thought would destroy me. I discovered that being held by God doesn't mean being protected from all loss, but it does mean never having to face loss alone. This understanding completely changed how I approached every other area of uncertainty in my life. When my teenage daughter started making choices I disagreed with, instead of panicking about her future, I learned to hold my concerns with open hands while trusting that God loved her even more than I did. When my business faced financial challenges during a difficult economic period, instead of staying awake all night, trying to figure out how to control outcomes I couldn't control, I learned to take wise action while resting in the knowledge that my ultimate security wasn't dependent on any particular business result. Each situation became an opportunity to practice what I was learning about supernatural safety. Not safety from difficulty, but safety in difficulty. Not protection from uncertainty, but peace in the midst of uncertainty. Not immunity from loss, but the assurance that no loss could separate me from the love that defines my deepest identity. And here's what I discovered through all these experiences. The more I practiced finding my safety in God's arms, rather than in my ability to control my circumstances, the more capable I became of handling whatever circumstances actually arose. When you're not exhausting yourself with constant worry and worst-case scenario planning, you have much more emotional and mental energy available for responding wisely to real challenges when they occur. When you're not paralyzed by fear of what might happen, you're much more present and effective in dealing with what is happening. When you're not desperately trying to prevent all possible negative outcomes, you're much more creative and flexible in finding solutions to actual problems when they arise. I think of this as developing what I call crisis resilience. Not because you become immune to crises, but because you learn to navigate them from a place of spiritual stability rather than emotional chaos. You develop the ability to remain anchored to what's most important, even when everything around you feels uncertain or overwhelming. This crisis resilience isn't something you can develop through positive thinking or willpower, or even through therapy alone, though all of those things can be helpful. It's something that emerges naturally when you've learned to find your deepest security in a relationship with someone whose love and faithfulness never change, regardless of what changes in your external circumstances. Let me give you a concrete example of what this looks like. Last year, I was working with a client named Jennifer, whose husband had been laid off from his job unexpectedly. They had a mortgage, 2 young children, and very little savings. Jennifer's immediate response was to go into full panic mode, staying up all night researching every possible way to cut expenses, applying for dozens of jobs on her husband's behalf, and creating elaborate spreadsheets to track every possible scenario for how long their savings might last. Jennifer was exhausting herself with activities that felt productive, but were actually just anxiety dressed up as responsibility. She was so focused on trying to control every variable that she couldn't think clearly about which actions would actually be most helpful. She was so afraid of making wrong decisions that she was paralyzed when it came to making any decisions at all. When Jennifer came to see me, she was on the verge of a complete breakdown. She hadn't been sleeping, hadn't been eating regularly, and had been snapping at her children and husband because she was so overwhelmed with stress. She felt like the weight of her family's entire future was on her shoulders, and she was convinced that if she didn't figure everything out perfectly, they would lose their house, their stability, everything that mattered to them. We started by helping Jennifer distinguish between what she could actually control and what she was trying to control but couldn't. She could control how they spent their remaining savings. She could control what jobs her husband applied for and how he prepared for interviews. She could control how they talked to their children about the situation and what expenses they chose to cut from their budget. But she couldn't control whether her husband got hired quickly, or what the job market looked like, or whether their savings would last as long as they needed it to. She couldn't control how long this difficult season would last, or guarantee that everything would work out exactly the way she wanted it to. Once Jennifer started focusing her energy on the things she could actually influence, instead of the things she was worried about but couldn't control, everything began to change. She started sleeping better because she wasn't lying awake trying to solve problems that had no immediate solution. She started eating regularly because she wasn't too anxious to notice that she was hungry. She started being more patient with her family because she wasn't carrying the impossible burden of trying to control their entire future. But the real transformation happened when Jennifer learned to bring her fears about their financial situation to God. Instead of trying to carry them alone, we practiced the 3-step process I mentioned earlier. When anxiety about their situation would start to overwhelm her, she would acknowledge the fear without fighting it, breathe into God's promises about His provision and faithfulness, and then take whatever next right step seemed most wise and helpful. This didn't solve their financial challenges overnight, but it completely changed Jennifer's experience of navigating those challenges. Instead of approaching each day from a place of panic, she started approaching each day from a place of trust. Instead of being paralyzed by uncertainty about the future, she became focused on being faithful with whatever opportunities and responsibilities she had today. Her husband did eventually find a new job, though it took longer than they had hoped and required them to make some difficult adjustments to their lifestyle. But by the time he was employed again, Jennifer had learned something far more valuable than financial security. She had learned that her family's well-being didn't depend entirely on her ability to control their circumstances. She had discovered a source of peace and strength that was available to her regardless of what was happening with their bank account or job prospects. Jennifer's story illustrates something crucial about what it means to be safe in God's arms during times of genuine crisis. This safety doesn't eliminate the practical challenges you're facing, but it does eliminate the additional suffering that comes from facing those challenges alone and in a state of panic. It doesn't guarantee that everything will work out exactly the way you want it to, but it does guarantee that you'll have the strength and wisdom you need to handle whatever actually happens. When you know you're held by someone whose love for you doesn't depend on your circumstances working out perfectly, you become free to respond to difficult situations with clarity and wisdom instead of fear and desperation. You become able to make decisions based on what's actually best for your family, not just on what feels safest in the moment. You become capable of being a source of stability and hope for others who are depending on you, instead of being someone who needs to be taken care of because you're falling apart. This is what leadership looks like when it flows from supernatural safety, not the kind of leadership that comes from having all the answers or being in control of all the outcomes, but the kind of leadership that comes from being so secure in God's love that you can guide others through uncertainty without being destroyed by your own fear of not knowing how everything will turn out. I've seen this kind of leadership in parents who are walking their children through family crises, in business owners who are navigating economic downturns, in community leaders who are addressing problems that don't have easy solutions. In every case, their effectiveness isn't based on their ability to prevent all negative outcomes, but on their ability to remain anchored to what's most important, even when everything feels uncertain. But let me tell you about the most unexpected way that learning to be safe in God's arms transformed my life. I became more willing to take risks, not less. When you're no longer terrified of things not working out perfectly, you become free to pursue opportunities that you would have been too afraid to consider before. I'd always thought that trusting God meant playing it safe, avoiding anything that felt risky or uncertain, sticking to choices that seemed to guarantee positive outcomes. But I discovered that the opposite was true. When you know your ultimate security doesn't depend on any particular outcome, you become free to take risks that align with what you believe God is calling you to do, even when you can't see how everything will work out. 3 years ago, I felt a strong sense that God was calling me to start a non-profit organization focused on helping people overcome anxiety and depression through faith-based approaches. Everything in my logical mind told me this was a terrible idea. I had no experience running a non-profit. I didn't know how to raise funds or navigate the legal requirements or build the kind of team that would be necessary to make such an organization successful. The old me would have immediately dismissed this idea as too risky, too uncertain, too likely to fail. I would have convinced myself that it was more responsible to stick to my private practice, where I had a steady income and a predictable routine. I would have told myself that wanting to help more people was a nice sentiment, but that I needed to be realistic about my limitations and stay within my comfort zone. But because I had learned to find my security in God's promises rather than in my ability to control outcomes, I was able to approach this decision differently. Instead of asking, "What if this doesn't work out?" I started asking, "What if God really is calling me to do this, and my fear of uncertainty is the only thing standing in the way?" I spent months praying about the decision, seeking counsel from mentors I trusted, and researching what would be involved in starting this kind of organization. But ultimately, the decision came down to whether I was going to let fear of the unknown prevent me from pursuing what I believed God was asking me to do. Starting the non-profit was one of the most challenging things I've ever done. There were moments when I wondered if I had made a huge mistake, times when funding was uncertain and I wasn't sure we'd be able to continue operating. There were setbacks and disappointments and learning curves that felt overwhelming. But there were also breakthrough moments when we were able to help someone who had been struggling with severe anxiety find peace and hope for the first time in years. There were opportunities to train other counselors and pastors in approaches that were making a real difference in people's lives. There were partnerships with churches and community organizations that multiplied our impact in ways I never could have anticipated. Today, 5 years later, our organization has helped thousands of people learn to find their security in God rather than in their circumstances. We've trained hundreds of counselors and ministry leaders. We've developed resources that are being used in churches and counseling centers around the world. But even more importantly, I learned that when you step out in faith to pursue what you believe God is calling you to do, He provides resources and opportunities and connections that you never could have arranged for yourself. Not because everything always goes according to your plan, but because when you're willing to trust Him with uncertain outcomes, He's able to work through your obedience in ways that exceed what you could have imagined or accomplished through your own careful planning. This doesn't mean that every risk you take in faith will lead to obvious external success. It means that when you're walking in obedience to what you believe God is asking you to do, you can trust that He will provide what you need to fulfill whatever He's calling you to, even if the path looks different than you expected. I think of friends who have left secure jobs to pursue callings that seemed financially risky but aligned with their sense of purpose. Some of them have built successful businesses or ministries. Others have discovered that what they thought God was calling them to was actually preparation for something different that they couldn't have anticipated. In every case, they found that stepping out in faith, even when they couldn't see all the outcomes, led to growth and opportunities that staying in their comfort zones never would have provided. This is what it looks like to live from supernatural safety rather than from natural fear. You don't become reckless or impulsive, but you do become willing to take risks that align with what you believe God is asking you to do. You don't stop using wisdom and seeking counsel, but you do stop letting fear of uncertainty prevent you from pursuing opportunities that could make a significant positive impact. You start evaluating decisions based on calling and faith rather than just on comfort and predictability. You start asking, what would love do in this situation? Instead of just asking, what feels safest? You start considering what legacy you want to leave and what contribution you want to make, not just what will minimize your chances of experiencing difficulty or disappointment. And here's what I've discovered about people who learn to live this way. They don't have easier lives than people who play it safe. They often face more challenges and uncertainties because they're willing to engage with bigger opportunities and more significant responsibilities. But they have more meaningful lives. They have a sense of purpose and impact that comes from knowing they're using their gifts and opportunities in ways that align with what they believe God created them to do. They also have a different relationship with failure and disappointment. When something doesn't work out the way they hoped, instead of being devastated by the setback, they're able to learn from it and adjust their approach. Because their identity and security aren't dependent on never making mistakes or never experiencing disappointment. They're resilient in the face of challenges that would overwhelm people who are trying to protect themselves from all possible negative outcomes. This resilience isn't something they have to manufacture through positive thinking or willpower. It's something that flows naturally from knowing they're held by someone whose love for them doesn't change based on their performance or their results. When you know that your worth and security are anchored in God's character rather than in your achievements, you become free to take risks, learn from mistakes, and keep growing without being destroyed by the inevitable setbacks that are part of any meaningful endeavor. Let me share one more story that illustrates this beautifully. I worked with a woman named Lisa, who had always dreamed of becoming a teacher, but had been too afraid to leave her corporate job because teaching paid significantly less and seemed less secure. Lisa had grown up in a family where financial security was the primary measure of success, and she had internalized the belief that pursuing her passion would be irresponsible and naive. For 15 years, Lisa worked in jobs that paid well, but left her feeling empty and unfulfilled. She was good at what she did, but she never felt like she was making the kind of difference she wanted to make in the world. She would come home exhausted, not just from the work itself, but from spending her days doing things that didn't align with what she felt called to do. When Lisa started learning about finding her security in God rather than in her paycheck, she began to question whether staying in a job that felt spiritually and emotionally draining was actually the responsible choice she had convinced herself it was. She started to wonder whether God might be calling her to use her gifts in ways that would require her to trust Him for provision, rather than relying entirely on her own ability to earn a high salary. The transition wasn't easy. Lisa had to go back to school to get her teaching certification. She had to significantly adjust her lifestyle to live on a teacher's salary. She had to deal with family members who thought she was making a foolish decision to leave a lucrative career for something that seemed less prestigious and financially secure. But Lisa also discovered joys and satisfactions that she had never experienced in her corporate jobs. She found that working with young people energized her in ways that no amount of money had ever been able to do. She discovered that she had natural gifts for connecting with students who were struggling academically or socially. She found that even on difficult days, she went home feeling like she had contributed something meaningful to the world. More importantly, Lisa learned that when she was walking in alignment with what she believed God was calling her to do, He did provide for her needs, though not always in ways she had anticipated. She received grants and scholarships that helped with her education expenses. She found opportunities for tutoring and summer work that supplemented her teaching income. She discovered that when she wasn't spending money on things that were supposed to make her happy but didn't, she actually needed less income to feel content and fulfilled. Lisa's story isn't about everyone needing to become teachers or to take dramatic pay cuts in order to follow God's calling. It's about what becomes possible when you stop making decisions based primarily on fear of uncertain outcomes and start making decisions based on faith in God's provision and guidance. When you know you're safe in God's arms, you become free to consider possibilities that you would have automatically dismissed as too risky or uncertain. You become able to evaluate opportunities based on how they align with your sense of calling and purpose, not just on how they fit into your plan for protecting yourself from all possible difficulties. You start asking different questions when you're facing major decisions. Instead of just asking, what will guarantee the best outcomes? You start asking, what would it look like to trust God with the outcomes while being faithful with the opportunities He's given me? Instead of just asking, what feels safest? You start asking, what would love do in this situation? This shift in how you approach decision-making doesn't guarantee that every choice you make will lead to obvious external success. But it does guarantee that you'll be living with integrity, pursuing the things that matter most to you, and using your gifts and opportunities in ways that align with what you believe God created you to do. And when you're living this way, when you're making decisions from a place of faith rather than fear, something beautiful happens to your sense of purpose and meaning. Even when things don't work out exactly the way you hoped, you have peace, knowing that you were faithful with what you believed God was asking you to do. Even when you face setbacks or disappointments, you have confidence that God can use every experience to shape you and prepare you for whatever comes next. This is what it means to live safely in God's arms. Not safety from all challenges or uncertainties, but safety to engage fully with the life He's given you, knowing that your ultimate security doesn't depend on your ability to control all the outcomes. It's the freedom to love deeply, even though love always involves the risk of loss. It's the courage to use your gifts boldly, even though success is never guaranteed. It's the peace to rest in His promises, even when your circumstances seem to contradict them, As we near the end of our time together, I want to leave you with the most important thing I've learned about what it means to be safe in God's arms. This safety isn't something you achieve once and then maintain through your own effort. It's something you receive fresh each day, each moment, each time you choose to trust His promises, instead of your own ability to figure everything out. Every morning when you wake up, every time you face a decision that involves uncertainty, every moment when fear tries to convince you that you're not protected and provided for, you have the opportunity to choose supernatural safety over natural anxiety. You can choose to anchor yourself to promises that are bigger than your circumstances, more reliable than your emotions, and more permanent than anything that could ever happen to your body or your earthly life. This choice doesn't become easier with time, in the sense that you stop feeling the pull toward fear and control. But it does become more natural as you develop spiritual muscle memory, as you accumulate experiences of God's faithfulness, as you build a history of discovering that His arms really are strong enough to hold you through whatever you're facing. The invitation is simple, even though living it out is a lifelong journey. Stop trying to create your own safety through controlling your circumstances, managing other people's responses, or preparing for every possible negative outcome. Start receiving the safety that's already been provided for you through relationship with someone whose love is stronger than death, whose promises are more reliable than your own understanding, and whose presence is more constant than your own breath. Right now, whatever you're facing, whatever uncertainty is keeping you awake at night, whatever fear is trying to control your decisions, you can choose to rest in arms that will never let you go. You can choose to trust promises that have never failed. You can choose to find your security in love that will never change, regardless of what changes in your external circumstances. This is what it means to be safe in His arms. Not protected from life's storms, but held through every storm by someone who is never surprised, never overwhelmed, and never lets go. This safety is available to you right now, not because of anything you've done to earn it, but because of everything He's done to provide it. The only question that remains is whether you're ready to stop carrying burdens you were never meant to carry and start resting in arms that are strong enough to carry both you and every concern that's been weighing on your heart. Whether you're ready to discover what it really means to be safe, not because your life is predictable, but because you're loved by someone who is bigger than any unpredictability you could ever face. The choice is yours, and it's available to you right now in this moment, regardless of what tomorrow might bring.